welcome. I'm Dan Slater. I'm the director of WCED, the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies. And today we're really pleased to have an amazing interdisciplinary panel to come together for our new session in the Flashpoint series on the case of Nicaragua. If you don't follow Central America or Nicaragua generally, you probably wouldn't know that there was just an election held. Usually when we hold these Flashpoint events, it's about countries and cases that are all over the international news, like Belarus and Hong Kong and Lebanon. But sometimes I think it's important that we try to call attention to places where the story might be a little bit less visually gripping, but quite gripping in terms of human affairs and when things are going in bad directions. And we're going to hear reports on what's been going on in Nicaragua out of the limelight, out of the spotlight, and everyone here will be much the wiser for hearing these tremendous presentations today. Let me just briefly introduce our fantastic panel of panelists today. So first we have Luciana Chamorro. So she is a postdoctoral fellow here at WCED. She's a political anthropologist who specializes in Central America and writes on revolution and its afterlives, populist politics, authoritarianism, affect, and aesthetics. She's currently preparing a book manuscript titled Afterlives of Revolution, Authoritarian Populism and Political Passions in Post-Revolutionary Nicaragua, which examines populist governance and affective attachment to the Sandinista political project after the return of Daniel Ortega to power in 2007. Luciana received her PhD in anthropology from Columbia University in 2020. Jennifer Goett is Associate Professor of Comparative Cultures and Politics at Michigan State University. She's a cultural anthropologist specialized in political and feminist anthropology. She has published work on indigenous and Afro-descendant social movements in Central America, particularly Nicaragua, and on state violence, racialized policing, land dispossession, and infrastructure megaprojects. Goett is the author of Black Autonomy, Race, Gender, and Afro-Nicaraguan Activism from Stanford, 2017. Her current research focuses on Nicaraguan asylum seekers in Costa Rica and the United States. Thaler is Assistant Professor of Global Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He works on conflict and security, authoritarianism and democratization, and protest and repression, focused on Latin America and Africa. His research and commentary on Nicaraguan politics has been published in Comparative Politics in the Journal of Democracy, and in public venues including Foreign Policy, Latin America 21, the Los Angeles Times, and the Washington Post. And in fact, just today, Kai has a new piece out in The Conversation on Nicaragua, which I highly recommend you check out. Kai received his PhD from the government department at Harvard in 2018. And finally, Emilia Young is an artist, organizer, and scholar. Her art practice utilizes digital media, archives, film, games, performance, and urban interventions for the creation of transnational and speculative feminist media and transformative justice projects. Young is completing her PhD in Media Arts and Practice at the School of Cinematic Arts at the University of Southern California. Her theory practice work has been published in Popular Culture and the Civic Imagination, Ada, a Journal of Gender and New Media and Technology, and the Additivist Cookbook. So, without further ado, our speakers will go in the order in which they are seated rather than alphabetically, and so Luciana Chamorro will go first. I think we're supposed to keep masks on throughout.
Those who are joining us on Zoom, we really appreciate you turning up for this conversation. I am going to be speaking broadly about what's been happening in Nicaragua in the past several years in order to contextualize the conversation to come with our other speakers. I want to say before anything else, I'm a Nicaraguan citizen and an anthropologist, and I've been doing work documenting the transformation of Sandinismo and everyday life in Nicaragua for a decade now, including the experiences of Sandinistas through this authoritarian consolidation led by President Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. And I want to acknowledge that as we sit here, there are over 325 victims of state violence whose cases have remained in impunity, as well as over 159 political prisoners whose cases have been denied due process, and we'll be hearing more about this as the presentations go on. So I'll make a few introductory remarks about the nature of the Ortega and Murillo regime, and we call it like this because Ortega rules with his wife, the vice president, as vice president. And I'll talk about a protest that took place in 2018 that escalated into a nationwide uprising, as well as an undeclared state of exception that took place after these protests starting in September of 2018, that are the context for the elections that took place on Sunday. So this will be by no means a comprehensive portrayal, but I do want to lay down some basic points to get us started. So the first thing I want to say is that the Ortega regime, although it has a revolutionary and socialist background, is not by any means a left or even a socialist project in any sense of the term. Former revolutionary commander who headed the revolutionary government of the Sandinista Popular Revolution from 1979 to 1990 came back to power in Nicaragua in 2006, but he didn't come back with a majority vote. He won with 38% of the vote, although polls in subsequent years showed like a widespread, broadening popular support. Throughout his tenure in power, Ortega dismantled incipient liberal democratic institutions such as the separations of power, the courts, the electoral system, putting everything under the guise of the president and his wife. And he also enacted a model that the government calls a model of alliance and dialogue, which instituted essentially a co-government with economic elites that once opposed the Sandinista revolution, many of whom had fled Nicaragua during the revolution. And at the height of this arrangement, which actually gained constitutional ranking, 40% of the laws in Nicaragua were co-written and administered in relation to the Nicaraguan Council of Private Enterprise, which organizes basically the private capital investment in Nicaragua, national investment. And economist Rose Spalding has written very extensively on this, and it's really good resources for understanding that relationship. So this is from the outset a project that wasn't intending to undermine neoliberal capitalism in Nicaragua. It was furthering and extending it through this alliance with economic elites. And it did enact social spending. There was $3.6 billion in oil revenue that was coming from Venezuela, borrowed from Venezuela, that was used to pursue social spending programs. These were not universal, they were always discretionary, and most of it happened outside of the national budget, so it was under the discretion of the FSLN party. And there was a tendency from the outset to sort of totalize the political field. And what I mean by this is there was a dismantling of social movements, even the ones that had brought Ortega back to power, NGOs that had been providing services in low-income communities in order to consolidate all social spending or all social programs under the guise of the party. So it canceled the legal status of NGOs and demobilized the social movements and even the unions that had supported its return to power. So this model produced many contradictions within Sandinismo and also outside of it. There's a conflict with the feminist movement of Nicaragua who, over the banning of abortion, which happened during Ortega's tenure in 2006, 2007, the dismantling of protections for women against violence, conflict with anti-extractivist indigenous peasant movements, conflict with autonomous organizations in neighborhoods, including many of the ones that I did field research with in Nicaragua. And there's a conflict with the independent press. Basically, from the outset, there was no access to government commentary on anything, no access to information. There's no such thing as FOIA or anything like this. And then the use of discretion of forms of repression against any sort of organized protest or organized dissent in Nicaragua, including political parties that were attempting to organize. So the state mobilized the police and also para-police or Sandinista supporters to dismantle protests of different varieties, but mostly social justice-based protests around anti-extractivism or around the different social programs like the Social Security, the way the Social Security Institute is organized. So in 2018, the IMF recommended a Social Security reform that was meant to raise people's contributions into the system and also reduce benefits. And the government passed these reforms under a presidential decree without any kind of negotiation with any of the parties that would be affected. And this produced a bunch of emergent protests. And those protests that were initially pushed by university students and also some of the elderly pensioners that were going to be directly affected, these protests were met with state violence. So the police and also some of these para-police forces were confronting the protests, and in the first 4 days of these protests, 54 people were killed. And in proportion to the size of Nicaragua, 54 people in proportion to the population of the United States would be roughly 2,700 people. And you can see the details of the first 4 days of the events and what followed in a report that was produced by the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights. There was a special delegation called the HIE, the group of international experts from the OAS that went to Nicaragua and documented these protests. And they found, we'll hear more about this, but they found basically that the government had committed crimes against humanity because of the way it had repressed the protests. And so Ortega called back the reform, but did not acknowledge any of these deaths. I'll show you as I go, some images of the protests as well as the paramilitary groups that emerged that were confronting the protesters. So because the government didn't acknowledge that this was taking place, calls for his resignation became nationwide. And this fueled basically an uprising that was a nationwide encounter. And we saw the occupation of Nicaragua's university campuses by its students. We saw neighborhoods that barricaded themselves into the neighborhoods to avoid the presence and the intervention of the police and these paramilitary groups into their neighborhoods. We saw these massive demonstrations that I think were like the first time in Nicaragua that this sort of peaceful demonstration in these numbers took place. These are images from, I think, from the Mother's Day March that took place on May 30th of 2018, where there was more than 500,000 people on the streets, and this is a country of 6.7 million people. So these protests, this is, people barricading up their neighborhoods to avoid the police being able to transit through. Funerals that took place because of the assassinations that the government was continuing to perpetrate. So in the span of the protests, 325 people were killed. And so in response, the government organized what they later called voluntary police. And they're essentially parapolice forces that were kind of uniformed in different color shirts and worked in tandem with the police to disband the uprising and to take down the barricades And this is where the bulk of the killings and the repression took place. And they used, the party emblems. This was not something that was hidden from public view. It was in the official news. It was celebrated as a victory, and it was narrated as the return of as the cleaning of as the liberation of the cities back from these terrorist protesters in the name of a revolution. So there was a return to a language of revolution that hadn't been as prevalent in Nicaragua, and that was taken up at this moment. These are images that appeared in the Sandinista news, like the official state propaganda newspaper. And in the same news cycle, there were these images along with the police. So they were evidently working in tandem with the police. That was not something that was secret. So basically, this produced an undeclared state of exception in Nicaragua. So we passed from a government that was trying to govern by way of alliances and dialogue to one that is basically not interested in garnering public support, but rather governing by way of domination. So the streets are completely militarized by the police, and the protests, all forms of demonstration have been outright banned by the police. And yeah, I don't want this to become like a house of terrors with all the different legislations that have been passed in order to prevent any form of dissent from emerging. But as you'll hear in the next panels, this has produced a broad exile. Over 120,000 Nicaraguans fled, hundreds of political prisoners, including 159 that remain in prison, 21 that were captured Saturday just before the elections, and those 159 include 7 presidential hopefuls that were trying to participate in the elections to contest the Ortega regime. So we'll have more time to speak specifically about what happened in the elections and the prospects of what's to come. But I want to give the space to Emilia for her presentation. We can talk more.
Thank you so much. I have slides, and thank you for being here. My name is Emilia Yang. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am currently, as Dan kindly introduced me, completing a practice PhD in Media Arts and Practice at the School of Cinematic Arts at University of Southern California. And in my dissertation, I have focused on process of memorialization of the victims of human rights violation in Nicaragua, some of the victims that Luciana was mentioning, through the creation of Ama y no Olvida, which means Love and Do Not Forget, Memory Museum Against Impunity. And this was made to dispute the official narrative that criminalizes the citizens who participate in civic protests, and also to challenge the climate of impunity that the regime has fostered. And all of this crossed me personally because my uncle, Vicente Rapaccioli, was assassinated on June 26 while he was passing a police and paramilitary controlled checkpoint. And his case, as all the cases of all the victims, continues without any investigation or due process. And my thinking is grounded in the productive tension between accounting and typifying the violence that we live, as well as documenting the practices and memory of resistance and public mourning against authoritarianism performed by the families of victims of state violence. It also emerged from the need to dig deeper and find ways, strategies to disrupt and create in the midst of all this violence. So Luciana gave like an amazing review of everything that happened in Nicaragua, but I'll give you a little bit more of the context, the moment in which the work takes place, and I will move into describing how we how we took some decisions to create this museum and offer some reflections on how these decisions center the victim voices. So as direct victims, we live the absolute lack of independence of all the powers, as Lucy mentioned, judicial, the public ministry, the police, the Ministry of Health, the Institute of Legal Medicine. What they created a truth commission, but it was also part of, working for the executive, basically. And for example, some of the things they did to the victims was the police refused to receive the complaints, to receive like the denounces, and to carry out the autopsies. So a lot of people didn't have autopsies from their victims' death. The city's town hall, the workers of the city's town halls, and the paramilitaries, they worked to erase the traces and the evidence of the deaths. They would clear the streets, basically. The hospitals denied medical care to the wounded and left them die in the gates of the hospitals. And sometimes, in order to give them the bodies of the victims, they would blackmail them. They would say, if you don't make a complaint, we'll give you the body. And you have to accept that this autopsy says a different cause of the death. But that's what you have to do if you want your family. And the violence of the victims' lives spread beyond their death because the government also denied the necessary rituals of mourning. Funerary rituals could not be carried out in peace since they were object of terror and threat. In many cases, the families had to perform their wake of their loved ones behind closed doors because there were paramilitary people outside. In some burials, there was little participation of the community because they were afraid to be attacked. And after the funeral, there's stories like that one, images of desecrated tombs, like another type of erasure. And as you can imagine, the grieving process remains completely pending, traversed by the absence of justice. And the other thing, like the other layer of violence, which more like a symbolic violence, was that they denied the existence of the victims and, of course, the responsibility upon their deaths. And so the lives of the victims became unrecognized, unvalued, and therefore ungrievable, as Jody Butler would say. And so official media and the government created a narrative that dehumanized protesters, calling them terrorists paid by the CIA, and in some cases turning the victims into victimaries. Something interesting that happened recently that we found out is that on October 2021, Facebook company Meta, I know it's the weirdest name, made public that they removed a troll farm run by the government that started in 2018 after the protests. They stated that it was the most cross-government troll operation disrupted up to date. And according to Facebook, the network was removed because it was aimed to amplify pro-government and anti-opposition content. So you can see both the public space and what it's like the digital spaces were completely controlled by the government, and there's a violent dispute over public spaces that prevent the construction of memory marks or memorials in urban space. There's been cases where people put like crosses on roundabouts or different, different ways of remembering, and they have been completely removed. And in response to this, the families of the victims created an organization called Asociación Madres de Abril, AMA, which means love. And the main objective, and I'm part of the organization, and our main objective is fighting together for truth and justice. And the active construction of memory became one of the organization's central objectives, as stated by the Manifesto for Truth, Justice, and Integral Reparation. And motivated by this objective, we created this museum. And the museum was created with a participatory approach in which the members of the association assume an essential role in the design, collection of information, and presentation of the museum while we're still in mourning and the repression continues. I led this effort with the support of the Nicaraguan Academy of Science and the Nicaraguan Center for Human Rights, CENID. Both organizations are also being attacked. The Nicaraguan Center for Human Rights doesn't even have an office because they removed their offices. So as you can imagine, it was very hard to do this. So in this participatory process, we held open discussions to conceptualize what memory is and discuss organic ways of remember. And we recollected, basically we did our own investigations because the authorities denied the right to justice and truth. So the recollection information was divided in 2 moments. In this moment, we drew maps that narrated the specific facts of the murders from their house to where they were killed, where they were attended, if it was like a clandestine medical place, and then the funeral and the routes between events. And after the families drew this, we turned them into real cartography and then into digital GIS maps so we could find some patterns of repression. And one of the things that the maps revealed is that the patterns of repression target historically indigenous communities in each city, especially in León and Masaya, which they have always been also a symbol of resistance, these cities. And because the workshops were private, they serve as a community building activity, producing recognition among the victims and their territories. In a second moment, we held individual sessions that consist of interviews and collection of photographic archive and memory objects. So we usually interview 2 or 3 people per victim. And as you can see, this image was, with this image, this labor was mostly embraced by women, who are usually the ones that hold and carry memory in communities. And in these interviews, we heard about all the multiple violences they face. And we created this website with the concept of an altar, presenting who the victims were, what happened to them, and how the family continues to search for justice. And we did not, because we're trying to dignify the victims, we try to tell their stories, who they were, what happened to them, without showing the gruesome images of their cruel deaths again, because it's not what the families wanted, and we thought that it also is like pornography of violence that desensitizes, and it was already on social media everywhere. And the content can be freely shared and reused as a resource and creation for new research, memorials, and creation. So we decided to challenge the government ban and create a temporary exhibition in the Institute of History of Nicaragua and the Central American University, and 20 young members of AMA were guided, and in many cases they gave their testimonies because they were also part of the uprisings. And the installation, this is how it looked, and the installation became what I call an animated demanding time, representing a larger group of people demanding justice, collectivizing their plea and their presence visually, a performance that took place on the streets and is no longer possible. This is the image. Each family, we took an image of a portrait of each family with their victim holding and demanding justice. It was also a place of gathering and creation. We held workshops of embroidery. And after, because of the repression was also, because of the security concerns were too great, we had to close down, and we turned the project back into digital and created interactive art book with the intention of translating this museum experience and activating memory in public spaces. So we were able to show some of the memory objects of the victims in the places where the victims were killed, which was not possible, but we did it because we added a layer of digitality. So to close, and this is how it looks, and we've been showing it in different places. Recently opened an exhibition in the National Assembly of Costa Rica that they were so kind to let us show there. And so to close, some remarks. We try to create a living archive that is not based on sacrifice and martyrdom, that presents the victims of state violence as heroes who voluntarily gave their lives for their homeland, but on the mourning and absence of the victims' truncated lives, highlighted the victims' struggle against authoritarianism and how their families continue to defend their right to life, justice, truth, and memory. We name how the violence was not equally distributed among the different bodies and classes. We signify that violence collectively, a recognition that not only happened to me, it happened as Nicaragua, as a society, in order to collectivize and reproduce solidarity and empathy. We articulate and dream of a future with justice without impunity. We reiterate that without the active participation of the families of the murder victims, there cannot be a true process of solving the serious social, political, and human rights crisis in Nicaragua. We dream of a society where the dignity of people is respected, and there is freedom of expression and thought, and the cycle of impunity and violence ends. Thank you so much. Fui muy rápido. Estoy bien.
All right, so now you'll see who on the panel actually has an aesthetic sense. Thanks so much to Luciana and Dan for organizing this and having me, and Derek for helping organize as well. It's great also to finally meet Emilia and Jennifer in person. So as the first couple of presentations have kind of laid the groundwork for, this crisis has, of course, most heavily affected Nicaraguans, and I think the focus should remain on the experience of the Nicaraguan people and their aspirations, but I'm also going to be talking a bit about some of the international implications of Nicaragua's democratic crisis, of the elections that happened on Sunday, and some of the international roots and pressures against Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo's power. So Ortega, pre-2018, had actually pretty good relations with the US. There was cooperation on a number of different fronts, on anti-drug trafficking efforts, especially along the Caribbean coast, which, as Jennifer has written about, were often accompanied by very racist policing on shore. Free trade. Nicaragua is a member of the Dominican Republic Central America Free Trade Agreement. There are free trade zones set up in Nicaragua where people are working in factories. And also, Ortega cooperated with the US in blocking northbound migration. In 2015 and 2016, when there were waves of Cuban migrants seeking to move northwards, Ortega closed the border, much to the dismay of Costa Rica. And so Ortega was talking the talk of being a leftist anti-imperialist, but was actually cooperating a lot with the US. He wasn't so much a thorn in the US side. And this meant that he got very limited pushback from successive US governments up until 2018. There were some statements and some minor funding restrictions around electoral manipulation and fraud in earlier elections, but the Nicaragua Investment Conditionality Act, the NICA Act, which aimed to restrict multilateral international financial institutions lending to Nicaragua, this wasn't passed until after the 2018 lethal crackdown on protesters. Now, at the same time, Ortega had been cultivating a number of allies around the region and around the world. And these are allies who have mostly been maintained up until today. So Venezuela was a key ally, as Luciana mentioned, under Chavez, and then early on under Maduro. Nicaragua was receiving oil from Venezuela at very subsidized rates. Things were being paid for using government funds, and then profits were being funneled through ruling party companies. So this was also a source of graft and more personal funds for Ortega, Murillo, and regime cronies. And this was key to stabilizing the Nicaraguan economy, but it gradually began diminishing after 2015, 2016, as Venezuela's own crisis deepened. And Nicaragua has also had varying relations with more left-wing governments around Latin America who were part of Venezuela's ALBA bloc, the Bolivarian Alliance for Our Americas. So, at one time, Ortega, with his leftist language that he would use, was considered a part of the left turn or pink tide when you had leaders like Lula in Brazil, Evo Morales in Bolivia, Rafael Correa in Ecuador. But many of those leaders were forced out of power or lost elections. There was kind of a rightward turn in Latin America, and now things have changed back a little bit. But as I'll talk about shortly, there's been some mixed emotions about Ortega. Cuba has remained a Nicaraguan ally, in spite of sometimes being frustrated with Ortega's behavior. And there's historic ties there from the revolution and some limited trade. Nicaragua's been rolling out Cuba's homemade vaccines for COVID, but Cuba is not a major economic partner at this point. It's a sort of historical and strongly symbolic supporter. Russia is an actor who gets a lot of attention in the US media for their support of Ortega, and Russia has provided military aid. They support the Ortega Murillo regime through propaganda using Sputnik and RT. And at the UN Security Council, Russia's veto power gives Ortega and Murillo a shield from broader potential international condemnation and crackdowns. And this has been in exchange not necessarily for a lot of trade, but Russia has an intelligence base and foothold in Central America now. But I don't think this should be anyone's main priority. And Iran and Nicaragua have also developed closer ties. This is mostly just about being authoritarian regimes that share an enmity with the US. So Andre Bank, Kurt Wayland, and others have written about how authoritarian cooperation today tends to be based on shared interests, not shared ideologies. This is not a Cold War redux. These are dictators getting along with each other as dictators. So before the 2021 elections on Sunday, there were a few steps that a number of countries and international actors had taken, especially following the 2018 crackdown. So the United States, European Union, Canada, and Switzerland had all leveled targeted sanctions against government officials and associated companies. There were increasing visa restrictions on regime officials, members of the Ortega Murillo family, because Ortega and Murillo's children are now in charge of a number of businesses, a media empire, they're in government posts. There was a resolution from the Organization of American States decrying the arrest of political opponents, the lack of conditions for free and fair elections. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, who has unimpeachable leftist credentials, has repeatedly condemned the Ortega Murillo regime and a variety of NGO reports. And then just last week, the US Congress passed the Renacer Act, which is supposed to be helping try to reestablish democracy in Nicaragua. And this calls for more targeted sanctions, reviewing Nicaragua's membership in the Dominican Republic Central America Free Trade Agreement, investigating and reporting on Ortega Murillo family corruption, investigations and possible sanctions around Russian activities and military sales, and reporting on human rights abuses, including against indigenous communities on the Caribbean coast. So these are all measures that came out just before Sunday's elections, in which all the viable opponents were jailed. The government only faced hand-picked, basically small puppet parties. So what are the post-election options? And I should mention the government claims that Ortega was reelected with around 76% of the vote, but independent observers have said that abstention was probably around 80%. There were not a lot of people out there crowding polling places. So what might happen? What actions might different international actors take? So there's this discussion of Nicaragua's expulsion from this free trade agreement, and also talk in Congress, in the US, of pressure on the International Monetary Fund and the Central American Bank for Economic Integration to cut off loans that have been helping prop up the Ortega Murillo regime and helping to keep the economy running more smoothly and not collapse. So this would have a financial impact on the government, and it would also put a squeeze on business elites who've been complicit in Ortega and Murillo's reconsolidation of power, who've sort of made their peace with authoritarianism and repression so long as they can still make a profit. But a deeper economic crisis would hurt poor Nicaraguans the most, and it would spur more migration, which for the United States and Mexico is seen as a problem. Suspending Nicaragua from the Organization of American States for violating the Inter-American Democratic Charter is something that's received increasing attention, and Nicaragua's repression, the level of lethal repression in 2018, the arrests of political opponents, these are unprecedented in Latin America since the 1980s and the fall of military dictatorships around the region. But there's limited political will or legitimacy in many ways for many countries to single out Nicaragua. Left-leaning presidents around the region have often abstained from votes condemning the Ortega Murillo regime and the election. Argentina, Mexico, Bolivia, they would be reluctant to join the 2/3 vote necessary to expel Nicaragua or suspend them under the Inter-American Democratic Charter. And Luis Almagro, the OAS Secretary General, on the day of Nicaragua's sham elections, posted a tweet about receiving the credentials of the new Nicaraguan ambassador to the OAS in a very cheerful manner. So there's not even a drive from the top of the OAS for this suspension. And for countries like El Salvador and Honduras, where their governments have their own authoritarian bent, their vote to suspend Nicaragua is kind of lacking legitimacy. More sanctions. All right, this is symbolically important, and it does hurt the regime financially. Ortega and Murillo have had to juggle assets, move around different government-controlled companies and officials, but sanctions haven't undermined their power yet. Ortega and Murillo can continue to play this shell game of finding ways to protect their own wealth. Through all of this, and whatever actions international actors take, in my view, freeing political prisoners remains paramount, and it's important to support Nicaraguan opposition actors in trying to forge unifying democratic visions. So what are some of the broader implications beyond just Nicaragua? There's a crisis of democracy in Central America, in addition to the global one we have. Ortega has strengthened his alliance recently with Juan Orlando Hernandez in Honduras, a repressive right-wing president who is the heir of Honduras's 2009 coup. Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, who my colleague Manuel Melendez-Sanchez has dubbed the first millennial authoritarian, he's using a faster version of Ortega's democratic erosion playbook in El Salvador. He's been eroding institutional independence and putting friendly officials in charge. He was able to win a legislative election and then quickly pass laws to strengthen his own power. He's removed term limits. He sent the military to intimidate the legislature. So he's starting down a very dangerous path. We should also think more deeply about the effectiveness of sanctions. Do they actually undermine governments and support opposition? Or is this an important statement, but a mostly symbolic statement nonetheless? Nicaragua and its democratic crisis is going to result in increasing migration. People are going to have a hard time seeing any short-term political change and improvement from the current repression. The economic crisis may deepen with reduced willingness for foreign investors to go to Nicaragua. And there's also climate change and a drought on the Pacific coast. This has been spurring invasions of indigenous and Afro-descendant communities' lands on the Caribbean coast. There's mass migration to Costa Rica, which is stretching resources thin there, and there's a potentially brewing xenophobic backlash, which politicians might try to take advantage of. And thousands of Nicaraguans per month are heading north towards the US, where punitive border policies try to keep them out and make it very difficult to seek asylum. So going forward, I think the big question is if international attention is going to remain after all of the editorials and news stories this week, or if Nicaragua and Nicaraguans are going to be ignored again until the next crackdown or until the 2026 elections. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. Oh. Is that how loud I'm supposed to sound? Shocking. Okay, I'm gonna see if I can put this right here. I'm really delighted to be here, and I wanna thank the organizers of the event and my co-panelists for inviting me. It's a real privilege and pleasure to not only see you, but also to be up here presenting alongside you. So I'm gonna shift gears just a little bit here and focus on perhaps a little bit more on the structural foundations of the current crisis that we see in Nicaragua. We have seen, obviously, what has been described here so well, better than I could do myself, in Nicaragua, a complete collapse of the liberal democratic order. Currently, few, if any at all, civil and political rights are guaranteed in the country. The Ortega Murillo regime's human rights record is really absolutely deplorable. And I've personally heard the testimonies of dozens of exiled Nicaraguans in my capacity as a researcher and an expert witness for asylum cases in federal immigration court, and their stories are absolutely hair-raising, as is the violence that they experience in transit, when they're stranded on Mexico's borderlands with the US and in US detention centers. But I want to be really careful not to exceptionalize Nicaragua. Material conditions in Nicaragua are not dramatically different from many other Central American countries, nor are they simply the result of the vicious dictatorship that currently rules the country. They were present under the neoliberal administrations in power before Ortega regained the presidency in 2007, and they've really only grown in intensity since then. So I have engaged in the vigorous online debate and analysis of Ortega's and Murillo's betrayal of the Nicaraguan left. And this analysis is well rehearsed and hashed over at this point, and I imagine that many of us are getting very tired of engaging in these ongoing arguments over what a real leftist position is or should be. And honestly, I'm really not at all shocked when politics fail to be pure or uncompromised. I think as Kai has really nicely demonstrated with his presentation. It does appear that most Nicaraguans did not vote in Sunday's election. Many were too afraid to leave their homes. I've seen also the 80% abstention rates cited that Kai mentioned in his presentation. All evidence on the ground since April 2018 suggests that most Nicaraguans now want different political leadership. But it really appears that there's little consensus about what that leadership should look like beyond the desire for political reform and rule of law. Some Nicaraguans do continue to support the government, and really this is undeniable. Luciana's work shows how that support is driven by historical experience and political passions, as well as other desires rooted in the neoliberal moment. Clientelism and access to resources are factors that humans are factors, but humans don't make decisions solely based on economic self-interest, as the neoliberals would like us to believe. But to be absolutely clear, I'm not calling for greater nuance or complexity in our analysis. The situation in Nicaragua and beyond is crystal clear. We are facing a race against time to transform our economic system and challenge the corrupt political structures that uphold that system. This is true in the United States, in Central America, and throughout our hemisphere. Hemispheric violence is rooted in our growth-oriented extractivist economic model, what Sarah Bracking calls the logic of unstoppable time, a neoliberal paradigm that demands that everything at the frontier of commodification must be exploited to generate much-needed growth. This is a rapacious model based on the endless expansion of capitalist accumulation to the detriment of people and the natural and social infrastructures they rely on to live well. The concentration of wealth paired with austerity measures only harden the blow. The two events that led to the 2018 April insurrection testify to this. The first, a destructive wildfire in the Rama Creole territory on the Caribbean coast, started by a mestizo settler. One manifestation of the slow violence, to cite Rob Nixon, of incremental dispossession and environmental collapse in Black and Indigenous territories in Nicaragua. Two, IMF recommended austerity measures that cut pension benefits for the elderly. Austerity, along with one of the lowest minimum wages in Latin America and the courting of foreign direct investment, betray the anti-labor policies of the current government. Up until 2018, Ortega presided over sustained growth of the financial sector, which far outpaced his neoliberal predecessor. The state responded to those who protested the fire and the pension cuts the same way that most states around the world now respond to grassroots challenges to the dominant economic model, with repression, albeit this backlash showed particular ferocity. Young people who occupied public space and campesinos in rural areas suffered some of the worst repression. These actors were not a homogeneous group. They came from diverse political backgrounds and regions of the country. One thing that does unite those killed by the state is that they were mostly young, not entirely, but mostly young, and they were not wealthy or powerful. The country was mobilized by the horror of their deaths at the hands of the state, which catalyzed mass demonstrations throughout the country and ultimately shaped the symbolic foundations of the popular uprising. Emilia's work with Amma illustrates this so well. Looking back, it's now evident that the repression of the grassroots anti-canal movement and anti-mining movements in the years leading up to the April insurrection were dress rehearsals for the crushing violence that the state levied against citizens in 2018. To give context, two of Nicaragua's largest exports are gold and beef, largely for the US market. These primary commodities drive deforestation, environmental pollution, land theft, and conflict in the 30% of the territory that is titled to Black and Indigenous communities. According to Global Witness, in 2020, Nicaragua was the most dangerous country per capita for land and environmental defenders. Most of the individuals killed have been indigenous, Mosquito and Mayagna. The killings have continued this year with another massacre in September. The now infamous and unrealized interoceanic Grand Canal is also a product of the dominant extractivist model. The region's commodity boom, roughly between 2003 and 2013, accelerated the integration of extractivist sites throughout Latin America into what Martin Arboleda has described as a dense network of territorialized infrastructures and technologies vastly dispersed across space. Nicaragua's zombie canal, because it won't die and continually returns, represents one illusory artery in this circulatory system of capitalism which now traverses the entire geography of the earth. As Thea Riofrancos writes, quote, around the globe, conflict in relation to extraction, energy, and infrastructure has escalated, and it will only continue to do so in a rapidly warming and politically unstable world, unquote. The deeply unfavorable terms laid out in the canal concession passed by the National Assembly betray both Nicaragua's structural position in the global economy and what the current government is willing to do to maintain economic growth. If the project had moved forward, the entire southern region of the country would have become one massive sacrifice zone to extraction and global capitalist integration. So, to conclude, the restoration of civil and political rights in Nicaragua is urgently needed. But Wendy Brown also warns us that there's no necessary relation between having rights and being empowered, equal, or free. She notes, for instance, that in the United States, we have never had so many rights and so little power to shape collective justice and national aims. Given this, I want to keep my eye on the political horizon and the work we must do together throughout our hemisphere to confront the status quo. Ultimately, radical change is needed in the form of degrowth, less extraction, less production, and less consumption, alongside infrastructural justice, climate reparations, and massive social investments in the most exploited regions of the world. Thanks.
Okay, well, I want to thank all four of our panelists for a spectacular set of presentations. A lot of difficult material, but very necessary material. Learned a lot from everyone. We've got about 40 people at home or other places who are watching on Zoom. And I welcome everybody to ask questions who are watching from afar. And also people here in the room who would like to ask questions. Although, for starters, given just the amount of rich material, if anyone on the panel would like to respond to, or felt in any way galvanized by something else that was said, they wanted to underscore, I'd welcome you all to do so first, as people in the audience begin formulating their questions.
Well, I will just really thank the three of you for your amazing presentations. And I mean, this is not really a substantial comment, but I did want to highlight what Kai was saying in terms of the cozy relationship that existed between the United States and the Ortega regime before the protest. And one very kind of interesting data point for sustaining that too is the funding of military, naval military bases in Nicaragua by the United States government that were, the Nicaraguan ambassador went and inaugurated in 2017, just a couple months before these protests started. So it's that to me serves as like strong evidence to question the narrative that the Nicaraguan government has created about this whole uprising as a coup attempt produced by the United States government and with support from the United States government. And the other thing related to that is some very interesting antics that Ortega has used to try and communicate with President Trump when he was president, including trying to go on Fox News to kind of get his attention and be able to produce like a bilateral dialogue with him, like authoritarian to authoritarian. And he, one of the things they did was invite the Bible studies teacher of the White House, this guy called Ralph Drollinger, to participate in the 39th anniversary of the Sandinista Popular Revolution. So Ralph Rollinger was on the stage with the vice president of Venezuela, I forgot her name, Daisy Rodriguez, and Ortega, and then this kind of envoy of the White House in this kind of like attempt to do like a back channel conversation. So those are just things that point to like a different configuration of authoritarianism beyond like left or right, or even, beyond left or right.
Just to Luciana's point, only a couple of months ago, the US withdrew their military attaché from Nicaragua because he had been praising the Nicaraguan military as extremely professional and essentially, providing support for the government at the time, despite these narratives of the US being the enemy, and also despite official political criticism of the regime by the US government.
Great. So we do have a first question from the audience at home, from Emmanuel Orozco Castellanos. And I think this could be for everybody, although it probably it's most directed toward Kai's presentation. So Emmanuel asks, he says, some have suggested that Nicaragua's dire human rights situation demonstrates that the inter-American human rights system is doomed to fail. What role can the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights play in Nicaragua when so many members of the OAS are unwilling to take action against Ortega?
And I think in general, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights is an important institution for documentation. The record on enforcing accountability is, of course, very mixed. The Inter-American Commission and the Inter-American Court have been very important at times in Nicaragua and elsewhere, especially for indigenous and Afro-descendant communities in trying to gain and protect land rights. But really, this is a question of political will. You need member states of the OAS. You need actors who are willing to back up pronouncements and back up reports and condemnations from these regional bodies with action. In Central America, there's been very limited will in the SICA, the regional body there, to condemn or take any actions against the Ortega Murillo regime. And this is in part because many governments know these institutions could come after them, or they've engaged in their own bad behavior. So I think there are important questions about the legitimacy of these systems if they are not actually being backed up by their members. But the Inter-American Commission, I think, does still have a very important role to play in documentation and providing a forum for people and groups who have been suffering from human rights violations to make their claims known and amplify them, whether or not there is ultimately follow through.
Thanks. Anyone else on the panel like to respond to the question as well?
I have just sort of a follow-up to what Kai was saying. Nicaragua has, in terms of Black and Indigenous communities, particularly Indigenous communities, has an interesting sort of precedent-setting experience in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights with the successful case against the Republic of Nicaragua. I was from the community of Awastingni. So this was the first time that an indigenous community was recognized to have collective property rights. And it's established a precedent that has led to many, many other inter-American court cases, and it's become kind of a model for indigenous, and to a certain degree now, too, Afro-descendant land demarcation efforts in Latin America. But again, going back to this point that I think Wendy Brown makes, is that rights in themselves really don't necessarily ensure any kind of clear resolution or solution to problems. In the case of the Atlantic coast, 30% of national territory was titled to Black and Indigenous communities, really as a result of the West-Tingley decision in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. But we haven't seen the cessation of basically the devastation of those lands since then. It really has not been successful in securing any kind of secure kind of stewardship or possession of those lands for Black and Indigenous communities. And on top of it, it created an administrative structure that brought the central government into intimate contact and relationship with the communities themselves, which created openings to co-opt, basically, communal governance, and to work around resistance that existed within communities by creating new governing boards that were allied with the central government. And so you can kind of see that reality getting played out in real time in Nicaragua, that the judicialization of politics in Nicaragua hasn't, in Latin America really as a whole, hasn't necessarily resulted in any form of kind of real deeper structural or material justice.
We do have at least a couple of questions here from the audience.
So kind of directly off of that.
I'm going to wait for the, no, it's okay. The microphone's coming so people at home can hear too.
Hi. So kind of directly off of that, how have the Garifuna people been affected by like the Ortega administration or regime? Anyone can answer, I guess.
I don't personally work directly with Garifuna communities. They're a fairly small Afro-Indigenous group in Nicaragua. They don't as much have the same kind of broad-based national kind of movements that you see as much in Honduras, where they're very powerful and very clear about challenging resource extractivism and the neoliberal order. But they are part of these territories that have been titled, and so they're experiencing the same thing that everybody is experiencing. They're experiencing roads built into their territory. They're experiencing increasing settlements in their territory. They're experiencing environmental degradation, impacts on fishing, you name it. It's part and parcel of what is happening in the Atlantic region of the country.
Question for Emilia. So I'm wondering how, if there's so much like repression in the media and just in general way of life that people aren't willing to even go out and vote, how is AMA able to function, and how are people willing to share the stories in the morning that they've experienced while the government is so repressive?
Can you hear me? Yeah. Well, the repression has had certain phases. As you know, there was like the protests, and then after the protests, it was more selective. And in that time, we were able to do the research that we did. But at this time, we wouldn't be able to do it, basically. And I think that it also shows the strong commitment that the families have to try to get justice. The fact that they were the ones organizing, and we were organizing in like these clandestine networks with help of different educational, religious kind of organizations that helped us and host us. But it was very dangerous to do so. So I think it shows kind of like their commitment to do the work, and to also confront the government, to not let it unchallenged, because it has been either the political elite opposition that has faced the government, or the victims. But there's not much other voices. So I think that's how it has worked. Many of the people from AMA have left the country. The president had to leave the country because her office was raided. So I feel exiled because I won't be able to come back. So it's not without any hardship, the work that we've done. And we will continue to try to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I'm Luciana, too. I'm assistant professor in sociology. Thank you so much for the different perspectives about what's happening in Nicaragua. I was particularly interested in what Emilia and Luciana presented about, this view on the ground of what's happening. And I'm interested in hearing more from Luciana how this memory of Sandinismo is playing out now, these political passions, and how this affects the work that Emilia is doing, because you are creating memory now. These families, were they Sandinistas at one point? They changed. How all that is happening is changing the politics of memory from the time you were doing field work and what you learned, and from what's happening now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luciana, for that question. So I'll speak from my kind of experience. I did field work, as some of you have mentioned, in predominantly Sandinista communities, a lot of it with historical Sandinista militants that had participated in the revolution in different ways and that continued to be active in Sandinista social movements that were kind of became independent during the 1990s, but have different kinds of affiliations with the party, as well as with younger people that identified as Sandinistas, as most Nicaraguans did. That's, I think, something that's important to highlight. It's this project, despite its kind of authoritarian tendencies and the dismantling of liberal democratic incipient institutions, because it's not like Nicaragua was like the beacon of democracy, before Ortega came to power at all. So many people in Nicaragua identified as Sandinistas, and one of the things that is shown actually by Emilia's project, by the museum project, is kind of the background of some of the families that ended up as victims of state violence, and many of them have Sandinista roots. In my own work, there was basically kind of like a split within the communities where I work, where many of them did participate in the uprising, and others, especially like certain older historical militants, actually participated in the repression and were recruited into these paramilitary groups, in part because they were told that this was kind of their way of becoming relevant again in national politics. So many of these militants had felt that they had been disposed both by neoliberal, the neoliberal economic transformation, but also by the party itself with these transformations that were taking place. And so there were like active recruitment campaigns that were, some of them were shared on social media and stuff, where particular leaders of the party went into communities and to talk to these historical militants, and they told them that they had the know-how of using arms, and this was kind of their opportunity to show the younger generation that would call them irrelevant, that they still had a place and a position, a role to play in this kind of new Sandinista moment. And the other part of this is that at the very outset, when the protest began, there was a larger consensus about the fact that killing students in particular was something that was morally objectionable and that transformed Ortega into like a replica of Somoza. And that was kind of, most Nicaraguans, most Sandinistas thought that response was a wrong one, and that produced a lot of indignation. But the protests also began taking on an anti-Sandinista character as they evolved. So at some point, the protests started transforming historical symbols of Sandinismo, the red and black monuments that existed throughout the country, and painting over them with the blue and white flags of the nation. So taking back some of those symbols. And this was very painful for many Sandinistas, who then kind of like stepped back and kind of reassess the situation, also feeling like that maybe they were going to lose something that they had fought very hard for. So, I mean, in summary, it's been a very painful process for many people, many Sandinistas that have had to kind of confront the romanticism of the revolution. Many of us have had to do that as well. It's still an ongoing kind of debate and discussion, and the role of Sandinista memory has shifted over time. It's also inspired a lot of the protest itself, the barricades. A lot of the symbols of the protest come from the revolutionary history, and a lot of them are being kind of overtaken or transformed.
Yeah, memory it's been really interesting to see how this evolved, also very painful. As Luciana mentioned, many families were Sandinistas, many had also like previous losses, like they had killed the uncle or the brother during the war. So there's kind of like a continuation of this, but at least what they see now, and I talk about this organization because it's the one that I'm close to, they feel like, or we feel like the whole framework of human rights allows us to have a different relationship with the state and the demands that we're able to articulate, because before it was like, you would die for the nation, and it was like the sacrifice, and you had to do it. At least there's kind of like a change in conception on it shouldn't be like this. That's what many of the families talk about, that they don't want to have martyrs, that they want justice, but also as Jennifer said, that the rights does not necessarily imply transformative and changes. And we've seen also a shift in kind of like, and Jennifer writes about this, in kind of like some of the things that the Sandinista revolution really like made part of the culture, like that slogan that says Patria Libre o Morir, which is free fatherland or die, into a more like what you call like an ethics of life, which is free motherland to live. So, and I think many of the people in the organization in AMA are like from a feminist also organization that have helped, and we see the relationship with the sacrifice. We're trying to challenge those narratives of self-sacrifice that are so intrinsic to authoritarian, revolution, militaristic, kind of like patriarchal notions. Yeah.
Thank you. I want to commend the panelists for a really fascinating panel, and also for the organizers for such a great interdisciplinary perspective, because I loved hearing, through both of your presentations and then through the questions, all the various perspectives that people are putting out here. My own perspectives comes from the Department of History, and I want to ask a historical question, because I was really interested in this conversation right now about memory, but I'm also interested in its twin, in history. And I wanted to know if there's any consensus right now about what seems like a transformation in Ortega and Murillo and their supporters from what we think of as, their role in 1879 to what we see today. Is there any explanation? I mean, I know Jennifer said you're not surprised by betrayal or by cynicism, but is there any like more concrete, specific understanding of what explains this seeming massive shift, right? And then related to that is, should we revisit the history of 1979 with different insights now? In other words, what have we been getting wrong about 1979? Were there seeds and paths of all of this that we were not paying attention to, that we should now go back and re-examine? Because maybe there were, lots of clues to what was coming that no one paid attention to, or people paid attention to and no one was listening.
Do you want to hit that?
Great question. Anyone want to try to tackle it?
I mean, I'm not a historian, nor am I an expert on the history of the Sandinista revolution, but I mean, my comment about not being surprised about betrayal comes from the history of the left itself. I mean, Roque Dalton and Leon Trotsky are victims of conflict within the left, and you hear, a lot of stories about divisions, obviously, into the different tendencies, of course, but after the triumph of the revolution, about the sort of power-hungry and authoritarian kind of characteristics of Daniel Ortega and his partner. I don't have any special insight on that, really, beyond what I've read other people write about. I mean, maybe you all do.
And Ortega has long benefited from being underestimated. He was not who anyone expected to become the head of the revolutionary junta and leading the Sandinista party's Dirección Nacional. His brother Humberto was more of the military mind. Tomás Borge was, one of the original members of the Sandinistas and more of the ideologue. And Daniel, sort of sneaks in there, and then he becomes the primus inter pares, the first among equals. He's who people internationally are looking to. And then when Nicaragua decides to sort of try to relieve US pressure by holding elections, Daniel becomes the candidate. And so there's been a lot of reexamination by many people who were involved in the revolutionary movement of this period, and they'll often say in hindsight, we should have seen this coming. There's a lot of regrets. There was a conference a couple of years ago for the 40th anniversary that was at the Watson Institute at Brown University, and videos are online. They made podcasts, but there's still these debates where there are people like Luis Carrion, who's very apologetic about many things, including how the Caribbean coast and indigenous communities were treated, some of the more repressive and authoritarian actions of the Interior Ministry where he was involved. And there are some people who have not necessarily been fully on Ortega's side, Jaime Wheelock, but who still, try to find the good side of the agrarian reform and look past some of its negative aspects. So these are debates that people who were in the seats of power at the time are still having amongst themselves. But I think they're looking back and past some of the romanticism of the revolution, which I certainly have had in the past. It makes it much easier to see, okay, this was the moment where co-governance fell apart. This was the moment where, the mixed economy took on a different form.
So
Maybe I'll add a couple things if we have time. This is a really great question, and I've tried to kind of wrap my head around it myself in my own work, in my dissertation, and I think that it's imperative to look at this transformation kind of beyond the figure of Ortega and Murillo as like these as if they, in their personal betrayals, have made all of this kind of possible. I do think we do have to look back at the history of the revolution and rethink some of it in order to understand how this became possible and the continuities that exist in the ways in which Ortega and Murillo are governing today. And some of the things that I've looked at are, for example, the fact that the neoliberal transformation, austerity measures started during the revolution. They started between 1985 and 1988, and especially in 1988, suggesting that there was already a tendency within the revolution to move towards neoliberal austerity, even though they didn't really call it exactly that at the moment. And there's also, the revolution governed without a constitution. It was like a state of exception throughout. And in 1987, a constitution was passed, but it was never really actualized. So from the outset, you have a project that where law is grounded in the institution of the revolution and its members. And this is in part the way in which they understand themselves to be governing today. And we have to take seriously that claim that the Ortega Murillos make, that this is the second phase of the revolution. There's also, I think, an important way in which the sort of the totalitarian tendencies of the revolution are playing out again today in terms of subsuming all social organizations under the banner of the party, not allowing autonomy for the women's movement or other organizations that existed or that were vying for an opening during the revolution that was not possible. Yeah, so all of these things have kind of like, they have a history that we can definitely trace from the present to the current moment.
And I think just to add on to what you're saying, Luciana, is that the military structure is hierarchical, it's masculinist, you know, and that does have an impact on how state formation happens. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, I was recently listening to Luis Carrion talk about this on the NACLA, and I think he said that, you know, we weren't really that interested in democracy. It wasn't, it wasn't at the top of the sort of list of political objectives. So I think that really fits with what you're saying, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And just to add, in terms of like the changes in like memory and history, for example, all the memory of the struggle, of the Sandinista struggle, was kind of like co-opted by the party and control, and was like the state memory. And the 2018 has kind of come and opened that up, and also letting to know like what they were calling contras, and they were like, how do they call them? All these kind of like dehumanizing names also for the peasants who were fighting on the other side against the Sandinista. It has also led a little bit of an opening there to say like, okay, some of them were actually Nicaraguan, and they had to join one of the sides because, and this side maybe gave them just a little bit more leeway to be near their families, like different types of things that weren't considered when the revolution was happening, how they framed the whole conflict. So the 2018 has opened the space for some of these contradictions to emerge.
And that animosity towards, you know, the campesinos who did not join the revolution or went to the contra, you see it replayed in the ferocity of the repression of the anti-canal movement. I mean, there's a kind of overlaying of like that past history, I think, on the violence that you've seen taking place in the countryside, which didn't even end after 1990. It still was an ongoing thing. Yeah, it's interesting.
Well, it's striking to me, as you know, as one of the audience members noted, this is an extremely interdisciplinary panel, which I think has led to a great conversation. And even though we don't have any historian on the panel, that the amount of the discussion that's centered on the historical question, I think, is really telling, and I think is a great model for how to think about these things, both historically and in contemporary fashion. So we're going to have to end it there. But you know, thanks so much everybody for attending. I want to give a really big thanks to Derek Groom and to Jesse Miller for doing such a spectacular job of making this work technically, logistically. Hopefully this coming winter we'll be able to do a lot more things in person. This will be our last in-person event of the fall, but thanks everybody for braving the elements and braving the pandemic to come out and try to meet in person. But most importantly, I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank Jennifer Goett, Kai Thaler, Emilia Yang, Luciana Chamorro for really a spectacular panel. Please join me in congratulating them and thanking them.
Thank you.
Thank you.